It is the year 1453. The sun is setting over the greatest city on earth. For 11 centuries it has stood. Empires have risen around it and fallen away. Armies have marched to its walls and turned back. Plagues have swept through its streets and been survived. It has been called many names. New Rome, the Queen of Cities, the city that God Himself watches over. Tonight, it is simply called home by the last few 100,000 souls who remain within its walls. They do not know it yet, but this is one of the final sunsets Constantinople will ever see as a free city. Let your eyes grow heavy now, and let me tell you how it happened. To understand how Constantinople fell, you first have to understand what it was. Picture a triangle of land jutting out into the sea, where two continents almost, but not quite, touch. On one side, the Sea of Marmara. On the other, a narrow, sheltered inlet the locals called the Golden Horn, so calm that ships could rest there through any storm. And where the triangle met the land, facing west toward Europe, stood a wall. Not just any wall. The Theodosian walls had stood for over 1,000 years, and in all that time, no army had ever broken through them by force. They were not one wall, but three, layered one behind the other. An outer wall, a moat that could be flooded, a second wall, and then the great inner wall, so thick that two carriages could pass each other on top of it. Towers rose every 50 meters or so, giving defenders clear lines of sight along every stretch. Armies had come before. Attila the Hun had looked at these walls and turned his forces elsewhere. Arab caliphates had laid siege twice in the 7th and 8th centuries, and both times had eventually withdrawn, exhausted and defeated. For the people living inside, the walls were not just stone. They were a kind of promise, a reason to believe that whatever happened in the world outside, the city itself would endure. By the middle of the 15th century, that promise was wearing thin. The empire that Constantinople ruled over was, by this point, mostly a memory. Byzantium, the eastern half of what had once been the Roman Empire, had spent centuries slowly losing ground. Wars with Persians, then Arabs, then Crusaders from its own side of the religious divide, then Ottoman Turks, had worn it down piece by piece. There had even been a moment, 250 years earlier, when Christian Crusaders, men who were supposed to be allies, had sacked the city themselves, stripping it of treasures and installing their own rulers for decades before the Byzantines took it back. The empire never fully recovered from that wound. By the time our story begins, the once vast Byzantine Empire had shrunk to little more than the city itself and a few scattered territories nearby. Historians would later joke, with a kind of sad affection, that the emperor of the Romans could see the edges of his empire from his own palace windows. And yet, the city itself remained magnificent. Merchants from Venice and Genoa kept trading posts along its harbor. Domes and mosaics still glittered in its churches. The Hagia Sophia, a cathedral so vast and so beautifully built that visitors said it felt like standing beneath heaven itself, still drew worshippers every day. Life continued. Markets opened. Children played in narrow streets. Fishermen brought in their catch along the Golden Horn, just as they had for 1,000 years. But beyond the walls, a new power was rising, and it had its eyes fixed patiently on this one city. The Ottoman Turks had been expanding for over a century by this point, absorbing territory across Anatolia and into the Balkans. Constantinople sat like an island in the middle of their growing empire, a Christian city ruled by a Christian emperor, surrounded almost entirely by Ottoman land. Earlier sultans had tried to take it. Some had even laid siege to it, only to be turned back, sometimes by the walls, sometimes by circumstance, sometimes by their own internal politics, pulling them away at the crucial moment. But in 1451, a new sultan came to power. He was young, only 19 years old, and many in his own court and in the courts of Europe underestimated him because of it. He had been sultan once before, briefly, as a teenager, and had proven unready for the role. This time would be different. His name was Mehmed. History would come to call him Mehmed the Conqueror, but not yet. Not tonight. Tonight, he is simply a young sultan standing at a window somewhere in his own capital, looking in the direction of a city he has wanted, it is said, since he was a small child, listening to stories of his ancestors' failed attempts to take it. He does not intend to fail. In the months leading up to what was coming, both sides made their preparations, though the people of Constantinople itself remained, for a while, unaware of just how serious the threat had become. Mehmed began building a fortress on the European shore of the Bosphorus at its narrowest point, a place where the strait was so tight that a fortress there could control every ship attempting to pass between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. The Byzantines watched it rise with growing alarm. It was called Rumeli Hisari, the throat cutter, some would later nickname it, and its purpose was unmistakable. It would let Mehmed cut off Constantinople from outside help and from outside supplies whenever the moment came. The Byzantine Emperor at the time, a man named Constantine XI, sent envoys and pleas to the courts of Western Europe asking for aid. He shared the same faith as the Catholic kingdoms of the West, at least in broad terms, and hoped that shared faith, along with a shared fear of Ottoman expansion, might bring ships, soldiers, gold. The response was slow and thin. Old religious divisions between the Eastern and Western churches had left deep mistrust on both sides. Some help did come. A contingent of soldiers from Genoa, led by a skilled commander, arrived to lend their expertise. A handful of ships. But nothing like the grand crusade the situation truly called for. Constantine would face what was coming with the walls, the city's own defenders, and whatever allies chose to stand beside him. It would not be enough men. It would have to be enough will.
As the winter of 1452 turned into the spring of 1453, word began reaching the city in earnest. Mehmed was gathering an army. Not a raiding party, not a probing force, but a full mobilization. Infantry, cavalry, and something the city's defenders had never had to face in quite this way before. Massive siege cannons, cast specially for the purpose of breaking down walls that had never been broken. One cannon in particular became legend even before it fired a single shot. Built by a Hungarian engineer named Orban, a man who had in fact first offered his services to the Byzantines, who could not afford him, the cannon was enormous. It required dozens of oxen and hundreds of men simply to move it into position. It could fire stone balls large enough to level a section of wall in a single strike, though it took hours to reload between each shot. Inside the city, preparations of a different kind took place. Supplies were gathered. The great chain that could be stretched across the mouth of the Golden Horn to block enemy ships from entering the harbour was readied. Soldiers, monks, and ordinary citizens alike walked the length of the ancient walls, repairing what could be repaired, praying where prayer was all that was left to do. Constantine XI, by most accounts, moved calmly among his people during these weeks. Whatever fear he carried, he did not let it show. He would need every ounce of that composure for what was coming. Because on the morning of April the 6th, 1453, the army of Sultan Mehmed II arrived beneath the Theodosian walls and began to make camp. The siege of Constantinople had begun. The Sultan's army has arrived. Beneath the great Theodosian walls, tents now stretch as far as the eye can see, rows of them spreading across the hills outside the city like a second city springing up overnight. Inside those walls, a much smaller number of people prepare to face them. Let's rest here a while and look closely at both sides before the fighting begins. Constantinople was a vast city. Its walls stretched for many kilometers, wrapping around the entire peninsula. But the number of people left to defend those walls was small, tragically small, compared to what the situation demanded. Historians still debate the exact number, but most agree that Emperor Constantine XI had at most around 7,000 or 8,000 defenders under his direct command. Some were professional soldiers, many were not. Sailors pulled from merchant ships, monks who set down their prayer books and picked up spears. Ordinary craftsmen and shopkeepers handed whatever weapons could be found and placed along sections of wall that in better centuries would have been guarded by entire legions. Among this small defending force was a name that would become tied forever to the city's final days: Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, a nobleman and soldier from Genoa who arrived with several hundred well-trained, well-equipped soldiers of his own, offering his skill and his men to the emperor's cause. Constantine, recognizing both his experience and his value, placed him in command of the land defenses, the most critical, most exposed stretch of the entire siege line. It was, in truth, an almost impossible task. 7,000 or 8,000 men, spread across walls built to hold back armies many times that size, facing a force that would soon number in the tens of thousands. And yet, they stayed. Night after night, they walked their posts along the ancient stone, watching the fires of the enemy camp flicker in the dark beyond. On the other side of the wall, Sultan Mehmed's army was staggering in scale by comparison. Estimates vary, as they often do for medieval armies, but most historians place his forces somewhere between 50 and 80,000 men. Soldiers, engineers, labourers and support staff, along with an enormous fleet gathering in the waters nearby. Mehmed had spent months, even years, preparing for this moment. He had studied the failures of sultans before him. He understood that the walls of Constantinople had turned back every direct assault for 1,000 years, and he did not intend to rely on bravery alone to break them. Instead, he brought technology that no army had ever aimed at these walls before in this quantity. Cannon. Dozens of them, ranging from smaller field pieces to the massive bombard built by the engineer Orban, the one so large it had to be transported by a team of 60 oxen and hundreds of men, moving at a crawl for weeks simply to reach the city. This one cannon alone, once positioned, could fire a stone ball weighing hundreds of kilograms toward the walls. It took hours to cool, clean, and reload after each shot, but when it did fire, the impact was said to be felt through the ground itself, sections of ancient stone crumbling in an instant that had withstood centuries of lesser assaults. Mehmed positioned his forces carefully. His main army faced the land walls, the weakest and most vulnerable stretch of the city's defences, where his cannons could do the most damage. Other divisions spread along the coastline, watching the waters, ensuring no help could easily slip in or out unnoticed. One vulnerability, however, remained a point of hope for the defenders. The Golden Horn, that calm, sheltered inlet along the city's northern edge, had long served as a natural harbour, protected from enemy fleets by a massive iron chain that could be stretched across its narrow mouth from the city's shore to a fortified tower on the opposite side. As long as that chain held, enemy ships could not sail directly into the harbour to attack the sea walls or land troops along that vulnerable stretch of coastline. The chain, forged from heavy iron links, had protected the harbour for generations, and when the siege began, the defenders made sure it was raised and secured once more, sealing off one entire side of the city from direct naval assault. For the opening days of the siege, it seemed to work exactly as intended. Ottoman ships attempting to approach the Golden Horn found their way blocked, forced back out into open water, unable to bring their full naval strength to bear. It was a small mercy. But sieges, as history so often shows, are rarely won or lost by a single clever defence. They are wars of patience, of resources, of who can endure longest. And patience was something Sultan Mehmed had in great supply. Before the first cannon fired in true earnest, as was custom in warfare of the era, Mehmed sent a formal offer to the city. Surrender, and the people within would be spared harm, free to leave with their possessions, or remain and live under Ottoman rule. Resist, and everything within the walls, city, treasures, and lives alike, would be considered forfeit, taken as the spoils of conquest. It was not an unusual practice. Many cities, faced with overwhelming force, chose to accept such terms rather than risk complete destruction. Constantine XI refused. By most historical accounts, his response was calm, even resigned, but resolute. He would not hand over a city that had been the seat of Roman emperors for over 1,000 years without a fight. If the city was to fall, he said, in effect, then he would fall with it. There would be no surrender, only the walls, the small number of defenders standing along them, and whatever they had left to give. And so, through the middle of April, both sides settled into the grim rhythm that a siege demands. Each morning the defenders woke to the sight of the Ottoman camp, unmoved, unshaken, cannons being adjusted and repositioned along the tree line. Each morning, inside the walls, church bells rang, calling the faithful to prayer, as they had every morning for centuries before. Supplies inside the city were carefully rationed. Food, while not yet critically scarce, was managed with caution, no one certain how long the siege might last. Blacksmiths worked day and night, repairing weapons and armour. Engineers reinforced weak points along the wall wherever they could, using whatever materials remained available: timber, rubble, packed earth. Outside, Ottoman engineers began the slow, methodical work of positioning their siege guns, testing ranges, calculating angles, preparing for what would soon become a near-constant bombardment. Neither side rushed. Both understood, in their own way, that what was coming would take time. The city held its breath, and somewhere beyond the walls, in a command tent lit by torchlight, a young sultan looked out at the dark silhouette of the greatest city he had ever seen, and waited for the right moment to begin. The waiting is over. For weeks, both sides had watched each other across a narrow stretch of open ground. The defenders along their ancient walls, the Ottomans in their sprawling camp beyond. Now, in the second week of April, that quiet finally breaks. Let the sound of distant cannon fire be a lullaby tonight, not a warning. It happened long, long ago. You are safe. Only the story remains. The bombardment begins. On the morning of April the 12th, the great guns spoke for the first time in true earnest. Orban's massive cannon, positioned carefully opposite one of the weaker sections of the land walls, fired its first shot. The sound, witnesses would later write, was unlike anything the city had heard before. A deep, rolling boom that rattled shutters and startled birds from rooftops across the entire peninsula, followed by the crash of stone striking stone. It took hours to reload, but it did not need to fire quickly. It only needed to fire steadily. Day after day, the bombardment continued. Smaller cannons joined in, positioned at intervals along the land walls, chipping away at towers and battlements that had stood untouched for 1,000 years. The defenders watched, helpless in the moment, as sections of the outer wall began to crumble under the relentless pounding. But stone, it turned out, was not so easily defeated. Each night, under cover of darkness, defenders and citizens alike worked to repair what the cannons had broken during the day. Hauling timber, packing earth and rubble into breaches, rebuilding wooden palisades where stone had fallen. It was exhausting, endless work. But it worked. Morning after morning, the Ottoman gunners would find their previous day's damage already patched, the wall standing again, if only barely. Life under bombardment. Inside the city, daily life did not stop entirely. It simply adapted. Markets still opened, though supplies grew thinner with each passing week. Church bells still rang each morning, and prayers echoed through the great domed spaces of Hagia Sophia and countless smaller churches scattered across the city. Children, it is said, grew almost used to the distant thunder of cannon fire, treating it as simply another sound of the world they lived in, the way one might grow used to thunder from a storm that never quite arrives. For the soldiers and citizens manning the walls, however, there was no such comfort. Each day brought exhaustion layered upon exhaustion, standing watch through the night, repairing damage through what little rest remained, only to face renewed bombardment again by morning. Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, commanding the land defences, moved constantly along the wall, encouraging his men, directing repairs, appearing wherever the danger seemed greatest. His presence, by most accounts, gave the defenders something valuable beyond mere tactics, a sense that someone competent, someone calm, stood at the centre of the chaos. Emperor Constantine XI, too, was seen often among his people during these weeks, not confined to a distant palace, but walking the walls himself, inspecting defences, speaking with soldiers and citizens alike. It was, by the standards of many rulers before him, an unusually hands-on approach to a crisis of this scale. But then few rulers before him had faced a crisis quite like this one. The first naval attempt. While the land walls endured their daily bombardment, Mehmed also turned his attention to the sea. The great chain across the Golden Horn still held, blocking Ottoman ships from entering the sheltered harbour directly. But Mehmed was not a man easily discouraged by a single obstacle. He ordered his fleet to attempt other approaches, testing the sea walls along the Sea of Marmara, probing for any weakness the defenders might have overlooked. In one notable early engagement, a small fleet of supply ships, sent from the west, loaded with grain and reinforcements for the besieged city, managed to fight their way through the Ottoman naval blockade and reach the safety of the Golden Horn. It was a small victory, celebrated with real relief inside the city walls. For a brief moment, it seemed as though outside help might yet make a difference. But it was only a handful of ships, not the grand relief fleet the defenders had hoped for, not nearly enough to change the fundamental balance between a small garrison and a vast besieging army. Mehmed, watching the failed blockade attempt with visible frustration, began to consider other options. If the chain could not be broken by force, perhaps it could be gone around entirely. By the end of April, weeks into the siege, Mehmed's patience was beginning to wear thin. The walls, though damaged in places, still stood. The defenders, though exhausted and vastly outnumbered, had not broken. Every assault attempted so far, and there had been several, brief and probing rather than full scale, had been repelled, the attackers driven back with losses, the defenders holding their line. Some among Mehmed's own advisors, it is said, began quietly suggesting that perhaps the siege should be abandoned, that the city's ancient defences might simply prove too costly to overcome, just as they had for sultans before him. Mehmed refused to consider retreat. Instead, in the final days of April, he began planning something bold, something no army had attempted at this scale before. If his ships could not sail into the Golden Horn by force, he would find another way to put them there. The people of Constantinople, exhausted from weeks of bombardment but still holding their walls, had no way of knowing what was coming next. They only knew that the guns continued, day after day, patient and unrelenting, chipping away at a wall that had stood for 1,000 years. Mehmed had a plan, a strange, almost impossible plan. If his ships could not sail into the Golden Horn, he would not sail them there at all. He would carry them. Let your breathing slow now, as we follow this quiet, strange, and true piece of history, one of the most remarkable engineering feats of the entire siege. Behind the Ottoman camp, on the hills north of the Golden Horn, there was a stretch of land, not water, but solid ground, that connected the outer edge of the harbour to open water beyond the chain's reach. It was rough terrain, forested in places, certainly never meant for ships. Mehmed ordered his engineers to build a road across it anyway. Over several nights, in near total secrecy, thousands of Ottoman labourers cleared a path across the hills, laying down greased wooden logs like the rollers used to move heavy stone in ancient construction. Oxen, ropes, and sheer manpower were gathered in enormous numbers. And then, in the dark hours before dawn, one by one, ships were hauled up out of the water on the far side, dragged overland across the greased logs, up and over the hills, and lowered back down into the calm waters of the Golden Horn on the other side. Behind the great chain, inside the very harbour it was meant to protect. By morning, the defenders of Constantinople woke to a sight that must have felt almost impossible to believe. Dozens of Ottoman ships floating calmly in the Golden Horn, inside the chain, inside the harbour that had felt, until that morning, like the one truly safe stretch of the city's long defensive line. It was not a victory won by force. It was a victory won by imagination, patience, and an enormous amount of labour. And it changed the character of the siege entirely. Now, the defenders had to guard the harbour shoreline as well, stretching their already thin numbers even further. From this point on, the defenders faced pressure from nearly every direction. The land walls to the west bombarded daily. The sea walls along the Marmara probed by Ottoman ships. And now the Golden Horn shoreline, once considered safe, requiring its own watch as well. 7,000 or 8,000 men, a city wall that stretched for kilometres. The mathematics of the situation had never been in the defenders' favour, and now it grew worse still. And yet, remarkably, the city held. Days passed into weeks. May arrived, warm and slow, the kind of spring weather that, in any other year, would have meant planting season, festivals, ordinary life continuing as it always had. Instead, it meant longer nights on the wall, thinner rations, and a growing, quiet exhaustion that settled over the entire city like a fog that never quite lifted. This is the part of the story historians sometimes describe almost gently. Not because nothing happened, but because so much of what happened was simply endurance. Small skirmishes, failed Ottoman assaults driven back time and again by defenders who, despite everything, refused to give ground. Quiet nights where both sides simply watched each other across the walls, waiting, neither side certain when the next real blow would fall. As the weeks wore on, strange things began to trouble the people of Constantinople. The kind of small, unsettling events that, in a besieged and exhausted city, take on outsized meaning. There are accounts, recorded by chroniclers of the time, of an unexpected fog settling over the city on a night when the moon should have been full and bright. A fog so thick that a religious procession through the streets, meant to bring comfort and blessing to the people, had to be called off entirely. Some described strange lights seen flickering around the great dome of Hagia Sophia in the darkness, interpreted by frightened citizens as a sign that the divine protection long associated with the city was at last withdrawing. Whether these were natural phenomena, exaggerations born of exhausted nerves, or simply stories that grew in the retelling, we cannot say for certain today. But at the time, they mattered enormously. Morale, already strained by weeks of bombardment and thin supplies, began to fray further. Whispered doubts spread through the streets, quiet at first, then harder to ignore. Constantine XI, for his part, continued moving among his people, offering what reassurance he could. But even an emperor's calm has limits against the slow erosion of a city spirit, worn down day by fear, fatigue, and the ever-present sound of distant cannon fire. Somewhere in these final weeks, one last effort was made to bring outside help. A single ship, flying false colours to slip past Ottoman patrols, was sent out from the city in search of the promised Venetian relief fleet. Ships that had been requested, hoped for, prayed for, but which had not yet arrived. The small vessel searched the surrounding waters for days, finding no sign of rescue, before finally turning back toward the city to deliver grim news. When the ship's small crew returned and reported that no relief fleet was coming, at least not in time, it is said that Constantine received the news with quiet dignity, thanking the sailors for their courage in attempting the search at all, rather than despairing openly before his people. There would be no grand rescue, no fleet sailing over the horizon at the final hour. Whatever hope remained now rested entirely with the walls and the exhausted few thousand men still standing along them. By the very end of May, both sides understood that matters were approaching their conclusion. Mehmed, having exhausted the patience of a long siege and increasingly aware that a prolonged campaign carried its own risks, disease among his troops, restlessness in his own ranks, the possibility of European powers finally mobilizing a real relief effort, called his commanders together. The decision was made. There would be one final, overwhelming assault. Every available soldier, every remaining resource thrown at the walls in a single, decisive effort. Inside the city, Constantine gathered his own commanders and closest advisors as well, in what history remembers as a solemn, quiet meeting. There was little left to strategize in any grand sense. The defenders' options had narrowed, week by week, to simply holding their positions as long as physically possible. What remained to discuss was smaller, and in some ways heavier. How to face what was coming with whatever dignity and resolve could still be mustered. Outside the walls, in the Ottoman camp, preparations for the coming assault stretched through the final days of May. Soldiers were given rest, extra rations, and words of encouragement from their commanders. Ladders were gathered, cannons were repositioned for one final, concentrated bombardment. Inside the walls, the defenders did what they had done every night for nearly 2 months. They repaired what could be repaired, they took what rest they could find, and they waited, together, for whatever the coming days would bring. The long siege was ending. What came next would not be long, drawn out, or patient. It would be sudden, and it would be final.
May the 28th, 1453. Inside the walls, the people of Constantinople gathered for what many, without quite saying it aloud, understood might be their final evening as a free city. This part of the story moves faster than the rest, but you are still safe, still resting, still simply listening to something that happened long, long ago. Let it carry you rather than wake you. As night fell on the 28th of May, something remarkable happened inside the city, something that even now historians describe with a certain quiet reverence. For perhaps the only time in the city's long history, ancient religious divisions were set aside. Orthodox Christians and Catholics, who had spent centuries in theological dispute, gathered together inside the Hagia Sophia for a single, shared service. Soldiers came directly from the walls, still in their armor. Citizens, nobles, and clergy filled the vast, domed space, candles flickering against mosaics that had watched over the city for nearly 1,000 years. Emperor Constantine XI attended as well, before returning to inspect his defenses one final time, moving quietly among his soldiers along the darkened walls, offering what final words of encouragement and thanks he could find. Outside, in the Ottoman camp, the mood was entirely different. Fires burned late into the night. Soldiers were told, by most historical accounts, that the coming assault would bring not only victory, but the traditional spoils granted to armies who took a city by force. Anticipation and a kind of grim excitement spread through the ranks as commanders finalized the order of attack. Both sides, in their own way, spent that final night preparing for what dawn would bring. In the darkest hours before sunrise on May the 29th, the final assault began. Mehmed sent his forces forward in carefully organized waves, a strategy designed to wear down the exhausted defenders through sheer repetition. First came irregular troops, poorly equipped, sent forward in large numbers, intended less to break through than to tire the defenders and draw out their strength before the more disciplined forces arrived. The defenders, though exhausted from weeks of near constant vigilance, held their positions. Giovanni Giustiniani Longo moved along the critical stretch of wall, directing the defense, his presence once again a steadying force amid the chaos and noise of the assault. The first wave was repelled. Then came the second, better trained regular troops, pressing harder, probing for any sign of weakness in the exhausted line. This wave, too, was eventually pushed back, though at growing cost to both sides. Then, as dawn approached, Mehmed sent forward his final and most feared force, the Janissaries. Elite soldiers, highly trained and fiercely disciplined, considered among the finest infantry in the world at that time. They advanced not in a chaotic rush, but in tight, controlled formation, absorbing losses without breaking, pressing steadily forward against a defensive line that had, by this point, been fighting without meaningful rest for hours. It was during this final, most desperate stage of the battle that fortune turned decisively against the defenders. Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, who had commanded the land walls with skill and steady courage throughout the entire siege, was struck and seriously wounded. Accounts vary as to the precise circumstances, but the outcome was the same regardless. He could no longer continue leading the defense from the front line and had to be carried from the wall to receive treatment. His departure, even though intended to be temporary, had an immediate and devastating effect on the morale of the soldiers he had led for nearly 2 months. Word spread quickly along the defensive line that their commander had fallen. Some of his own Genoese soldiers, seeing him carried away, began to withdraw from their positions as well, uncertain of what was happening, fearing perhaps that all was already lost. In the chaos and confusion of battle, in the darkness before dawn, a gap began to open in the line, not through any single dramatic failure, but through the slow, cascading effect of exhausted men losing their footing, their organization, their nerve, all at nearly the same moment. The Janissaries, disciplined and watching closely for exactly this kind of opportunity, found their opening.
Whether these were natural phenomena, exaggerations born of exhausted nerves, or simply stories that grew in the retelling, we cannot say for certain today. But at the time, they mattered enormously. Morale, already strained by weeks of bombardment and thin supplies, began to fray further. Whispered doubts spread through the streets, quiet at first, then harder to ignore. Constantine XI, for his part, continued moving among his people, offering what reassurance he could. But even an emperor's calm has limits against the slow erosion of a city spirit, worn down day by fear, fatigue, and the ever-present sound of distant cannon fire. Somewhere in these final weeks, one last effort was made to bring outside help. A single ship, flying false colors to slip past Ottoman patrols, was sent out from the city in search of the promised Venetian relief fleet. Ships that had been requested, hoped for, prayed for, but which had not yet arrived. The small vessel searched the surrounding waters for days, finding no sign of rescue, before finally turning back toward the city to deliver grim news. When the ship's small crew returned and reported that no relief fleet was coming, at least not in time, it is said that Constantine received the news with quiet dignity, thanking the sailors for their courage in attempting the search at all, rather than despairing openly before his people. There would be no grand rescue, no fleet sailing over the horizon at the final hour. Whatever hope remained now rested entirely with the walls and the exhausted few thousand men still standing along them. By the very end of May, both sides understood that matters were approaching their conclusion. Mehmed, having exhausted the patience of a long siege and increasingly aware that a prolonged campaign carried its own risks, disease among his troops, restlessness in his own ranks, the possibility of European powers finally mobilizing a real relief effort, called his commanders together. The decision was made. There would be one final, overwhelming assault. Every available soldier, every remaining resource thrown at the walls in a single, decisive effort. Inside the city, Constantine gathered his own commanders and closest advisors as well, in what history remembers as a solemn, quiet meeting. There was little left to strategize in any grand sense. The defenders' options had narrowed, week by week, to simply holding their positions as long as physically possible. What remained to discuss was smaller, and in some ways heavier. How to face what was coming with whatever dignity and resolve could still be mustered. Outside the walls, in the Ottoman camp, preparations for the coming assault stretched through the final days of May. Soldiers were given rest, extra rations, and words of encouragement from their commanders. Ladders were gathered, cannons were repositioned for one final, concentrated bombardment. Inside the walls, the defenders did what they had done every night for nearly 2 months. They repaired what could be repaired, they took what rest they could find, and they waited, together, for whatever the coming days would bring. The long siege was ending. What came next would not be long, drawn out, or patient. It would be sudden, and it would be final, desperately seeking any ship that might carry them to safety. Others sought shelter within churches, including the great Hagia Sophia itself, where crowds gathered in fear, uncertain of what conquest would mean for their lives, their families, their faith. Sultan Mehmed II, only 21 years old, entered the city later that day. By most historical accounts, he moved through the fallen streets with a mixture of triumph and something closer to reflection, reportedly pausing at the ruins of the old imperial palace and remarking, through a translator, on the strange fate of empires, quoting old Persian poetry about the impermanence of even the grandest human achievements. He rode to the Hagia Sophia itself and stood beneath its vast dome, the same dome that had inspired awe in visitors for 900 years, and ordered that it be preserved, converted rather than destroyed, its future now bound to a new empire rather than the one that had built it. The Eastern Roman Empire, the last living remnant of ancient Rome, had come to its end. A new age for the city, and for the region entire, had just begun.
The city has fallen. The last emperor is gone.
A new sultan walks streets that, until this morning, belonged to another world entirely. But history rarely ends cleanly at the moment of a single battle. Let's rest here, gently, and follow what came after, the quiet, slow turning of one age into another. In the days and weeks that followed the conquest, Constantinople began, slowly, to change. Mehmed, now remembered by history as Mehmed the Conqueror, moved quickly to secure and restore order to his newly won city. Despite the customary practices of the era, which often allowed conquering armies days of unrestricted plunder, Mehmed brought this to an end sooner than many expected, keen to preserve his new capital rather than see it destroyed in the aftermath of its own capture. The Hagia Sophia, spared at his direct order, was converted into a mosque, its Christian mosaics plastered over rather than destroyed outright. A decision that would, centuries later, allow many of them to be carefully uncovered and restored, preserved almost by accident through the layers meant to conceal them. Mehmed declared the city his new capital, moving the seat of Ottoman power from Edirne to Constantinople itself. He encouraged resettlement, inviting merchants, craftsmen, and scholars of many faiths and backgrounds to return to or newly inhabit the city, understanding that a capital needed people, trade, and life to truly thrive, not merely conquest. Slowly, the city that had been the heart of the Byzantine world became instead the heart of a new and rapidly expanding Ottoman one. Its old name would persist for centuries in common use, even as gradually, over a long span of time, it came to be known by the name still used today. The disappearance of Constantine XI remained, and remains still, one of history's quiet, unresolved mysteries. No confirmed grave was ever found. No definitive account of his final moments was ever agreed upon by chroniclers of the time, many of whom offered differing versions. Some describing his death fighting near the breach, others suggesting other, less certain fates. Over the centuries, his story took on an almost legendary quality among Greek communities in particular, with folk tales emerging that imagined him not truly dead, but turned to stone by an angel, sleeping beneath the city, waiting for the day he might awaken and reclaim it. It is, of course, only a story. But it speaks to something real, the way a city and a people process the loss of something that feels, in the moment, unimaginable. Constantine XI remains to this day remembered as the last Roman emperor, a ruler who chose to stand and fall with his city rather than flee it. The fall of Constantinople sent ripples far beyond the city's own walls. Refugees and scholars who fled in the years surrounding the conquest carried with them manuscripts, knowledge, and ideas preserved for centuries within Byzantine libraries. A migration of learning that many historians consider one of the contributing sparks behind the broader intellectual flowering that would soon sweep across Western Europe. The loss of Constantinople as a trading link between East and West also pushed European kingdoms to seek new routes to the wealth of Asia, a search that, within just a few decades, would help drive the age of maritime exploration, sending ships out across oceans in search of paths that no longer ran conveniently through a single Christian city controlling the crossroads between continents. In this way, the ending of one great age quietly, almost invisibly, helped set the stage for another. Today, the city that was once called Constantinople still stands, though under yet another name, its ancient walls still visible in places, weathered but present, a physical reminder of the events that once unfolded along their length. The Hagia Sophia still stands as well, its dome still rising above the city skyline, having passed through the centuries as mosque, briefly as museum, and mosque once more, its long history a kind of quiet monument to just how many different ages a single building, a single city, can hold within its walls. Historians still study the siege in remarkable detail. The ships hauled over land, the massive cannons that reshaped the very nature of siege warfare, the small band of exhausted defenders who held an impossible line for nearly 2 months against overwhelming odds. It remains, even now, one of history's great turning points, the quiet, final closing of the ancient world, and the equally quiet opening of a new one.
And so, the story ends here, as all such stories eventually do. An empire, once vast, reduced at last to a single city, and then to memory. A young sultan who became a conqueror. An emperor who chose to stay rather than flee, and whose fate we still do not fully know. Somewhere, beyond the walls of your own room tonight, the world continues on, just as it always has. Indifferent to empires, indifferent to conquest, simply turning, quietly, from one age into the next. Let it turn without you for a while. Rest now. The story is over. Sleep is what remains.